الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين. Welcome all of you. My name is Sophia Said. I'm the chairwoman of Medina Institute of Little Rock, Arkansas, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you back to our second workshop on race in Islam. Just like last week, we have both of our esteemed panelists here, Imam Dawood Walid and Dr. Sara Tariq. And again, just like last week, each one of will have 30 to 35 minutes of teaching, and then we will have a question answer sessions with both of them. While they're teaching, you all know the chat feature of the Zoom. If you have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat feature so we can pick it up in our question and answer session. And also please remember to mute your mics as our speakers are presenting. Starting off again with Imam Dawood Walid, who is a recognized Imam, leader, scholar, author, theologian, and currently serving as the executive director of Michigan chapter of CARE America. We welcome you to our classroom, Imam Dawood. Last week, and Sara, you all know our beloved teacher, the board member of Medina Institute, Arkansas. Welcome to today's class, Sara. Last week, both of them talked about the underlying causes of racism. And if you remember, Sara briefly talked about implicit bias and also said that it's a habit of mind which is changeable. And Imam Dawood Walid also talked about kibr as being one of the root causes of racism, but it's also a disease of the heart, and every disease has a cure. So starting from that, I just wanted to remind you that today we will be talking about the spiritual remedies for the root causes of racism, the prophetic model and the solutions that are given to us from our religion, and also the modern day secular and policy treatments that we can do and the applications that we can undertake. So having said that, I would give our virtual mic to Imam Dawood Walid so you can start today's discussion.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين ورضوان الله تعالى صحابته الراشدين والتابعين لهم بخير وإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وبعد. It's a pleasure to be here with you all again this Saturday, and if I'm going to alhamdulillah, it's been shared, so we're going to go to this here for the shared screen and inshallah talk very briefly about the spiritual remedies for racism. So, general prescription for spiritual diseases. So just broadly speaking, this relates to a hadith of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said, "Likulli da'in dawa," for every disease is a cure, right? So there are physical diseases and inward maladies, and even when it comes to physical diseases, and there's a correlation between the spiritual state of people and actually certain diseases that can come about. But for every disease there's a cure, but also for spiritual diseases. Now for outward diseases, Allah has created a cure for the physical diseases. Even if we haven't found it yet, there is a cure, right? There's a cure for all diseases except for death. But now, or all states except for death. Now, regarding the spiritual life and spiritual maladies, there are also cures. And if you, for those of you who are studying Arabic language, you will see that the words da for disease and cure, dua, actually are related to the same root word. Like they both have what's called huruf al-illa in them. They're actually linguistically related, which goes to what we've been taught by our spiritual doctors such as Imam Ghazali, that generally speaking, a prescription for a spiritual disease is basically to invert the disease, right? Just as da and dua, like dua is related to da. So is to incline towards doing the opposite of the malady, right? It's inclining during the opposite of the malady. So let's give an example. So al-bukhl is a spiritual disease, right? And this means stinginess. So one of the cures of that is to incline one's heart and then struggle to actually give, right? To help shed oneself from the inward spiritual disease of being stingy, of holding on to one's wealth and not sharing one's wealth, or being charitable, for instance. So likulli da'in dawa, and this hadith is narrated by al-Bukhari, and it is sahih. Now, addressing the disease of arrogance, or al-kibr, and this word al-kibr that relates to arrogance starts in the heart, and then the word takabbur means to actually display and exert and manifest the kibr, right? So the inward reality of the heart is al-kibr, and then the manifestation of that, it can be through speech or deed, would be a takabbur, and to when someone tries to lord over as if they're better than other people or bigger than other people. So al-kibr, as we mentioned last week, this is one of, not the only, but this is the primary underlying spiritual malady behind outward manifestations of al-unsuriya, which is the term for racism in the Arabic language. And as was discussed last week, as I talked about, as well as Dr. Sarah mentioned about this as well, is that there is individual acts of racism and bigotry and bias, but there's also, this seeps out into being societal, also structural in nature. So there's individual kibr, which then seeps over when people are in the dominant culture, or people who have positional power then exert their arrogance, and it becomes societal takabbur, right? Individual to those who are in power or have positional power, and then exert their will over people and look down upon others. And let me also say this, and this is true for people who are not Muslims as well as Muslims, that one can be so-called religious, or quote-unquote religious, and for Muslims, you can even have a wird, you can have a dhikr, and do all these things, yet still be arrogant, right? Just having a topi and a beard, or having a hijab, and saying that you love Abdul Qadir Jilani or whoever, that in and of itself is not a protection from kibr in and of itself. And unfortunately, there are many Muslims who do outward things and are still racist, right? I mean, I experienced a lot of racism growing up in Central Virginia, but the first time I ever got called a slave, and the first time I ever got called a black devil, were in the holy cities of Medina and Mecca, where I had Arab call me slave, where I had Arab call me Shaitan Aswad, a black devil, right? So I never got called this, even by the biggest redneck in Virginia. I never got called those words. So, but big beard, and have turban on and thobe and all of these things, right? So I just really want to stress that point, that being quote unquote religious, and even in American society, historically and to this day, it's so-called Christian people and so-called conservative Christians, or those who call themselves being what was called back in the 90s, in the days of Newt Gingrich, the moral majority. These are some of the most racist people, and go to church every Sunday, right? So when we're talking about addressing this disease, we need to deal with remedies, not just with outward superficial things, but really dig deep into the matter for the tazkiyah, for the spiritual purification. So one of the great scholars, and part of also, and I'll get this later, but part of us undoing racism, and anti-Black racism in particular, and we should learn about the great African scholars of Islam who have contributed so much. There is a rich scholarly tradition of men and women in West Africa. Like all the scholars just weren't in the lands of the Arabs and Persians, right? So one of these great scholars is Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, a great Maliki scholar of the 19th century Senegal, Gambia region. And he wrote one of his most epic works is called Masalik al-Jinan, and it's a poem. And in this poem, he goes through all the spiritual diseases and he talks about the remedies, the spiritual remedies. It's been translated, I believe, in English and in French, but if you want it in Arabic, I have it in PDF file. I could send it to you, but I believe it's online in English as well as in French. And one of the spiritual remedies he mentions in regards to addressing this disease of kibr is to remind oneself and others about the reality of their birth, their life, and their death. Now, he wrote this poem in a specific context. This is when the French came to colonialize the area of Senegal. He was dealing with very racist behavior from Frenchmen. As a matter of fact, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba was actually arrested and was exiled to Gabon by the French, right? Because they saw what he was teaching as far as the dignity and spiritual liberation. The French saw him as a huge threat, of the most threatening scholar in West Africa at the time that the French felt they had to deal with. So in Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba's poem, and I'm giving a summary, he said that, know that all of you were created from nutfa, from smelly nutfa. Nutfa means sperm, right? All of you were created from smelly sperm. Then you walk this life as a sack of feces, meaning that you have feces in you every day. Then you return to the earth as a rotten corpse. Know that all of you are the children of Adam, and Adam came from the dirt. This is what Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba wrote in his poem. Now, this is very interesting, right? That first we were created from a substance that is considered najasa, right? It's ritually impure. If nutfa comes outside of a man, or if it gets upon a woman, then what? You're ritually impure. Then you have to go make ghusl, correct? Then feces, when we relieve ourselves for the call of nature and relieve feces, this is najasa too, right? And you have to go make wudu. You're not in the state of tahara. Then even when you die and you become a rotten, smelly corpse, even those who make the ghusl mayat and wash you, that they themselves have to go make ghusl before they can pray, because they've touched you and they have to renew their ritual purity, right, to pray or to read Quran. So there is a sign in this, right? Looking at this smelly substance, no one can tell any superiority by this. All feces stinks. And when someone dies and their bodies decompose, you can't tell who was the Arab or the non-Arab or black or white by looking at a skeleton. So this is the message that Ahmadou Bamba said. If any person with any sense were reminded of their origin, going to their starting place, their ending point, that this would help to say that we are all children of Adam, because we all start from one point, from one smelly substance. We all were birthed by a mother. We all live this life. All of our stuff stinks. We all have to answer the call of nature. No one's an angel, and we all are going to die, right? Is one thing he mentioned. Another thing that's mentioned is the taking of a spiritual guide and to do khidmah, or to serve him or her. And we say a spiritual guide, it could be sheikh, at tarbiyah is another word, or a murshid or murshida, but to take a spiritual guide. And the Gnostics have a famous saying, man laysa lahu sheikh, sheikhuhu ash-shaytan. It sounds like a tough statement. Whoever does not have a sheikh or a guide, his sheikh is the devil, it's a shaitan. Why is that? Because only relying on oneself to guide oneself in this life in and of itself is a sign of kibr, is a sign of arrogance. And as we mentioned, Iblis and his downfall from the garden, who's the original racist, that he was arrogant. He had kibr. You see the connection in the sayings? So taking a spiritual guide is a way of, and serving that guide, a male or female, and I say that females should look for a spiritual mentor to spend close time with who's a female. Sheikh at ta'lim is different from sheikh at tarbiyah. The sheikh of instruction of one's religion, of aqidah and fiqh and these things, and the one-on-one relationship, or being in a classroom setting in a halaqah, that's fine. But to sit and actually serve and spend time and serve someone on a one-on-one basis, this should be same gender, right? And we know of issues of some men and women who've got themselves in trouble getting too close to each other and crossing the line, right? So if we look at Surah Al-Kahf and ponder this, I want to give 2 examples about this, then we'll go to the next part. In Surah Al-Kahf, we see that one of the greatest messengers of God, Musa alayhi salam, and Musa alayhi salam, as a young man, looked for and found a spiritual guide. We know him as Al-Khidr alayhi salam. He had a spiritual guide. So if one of God's greatest prophets took on a spiritual guide and humbled himself to a spiritual guide to help him with his nafs, who do we think we are? That we don't need a guide? That we don't need a mentor? When one of God's greatest prophets had a guide? This is self-delusion. And the nafs, the ego, is prone towards self-deception and making itself bigger than what it is. And if you catch anyone who has jahl murakab, someone who is like a hardcore racist, someone who's firm in their bigotry, then you will see this is a person who is self-deluded. This person is self-deluded. The second example is this. I'll give you a primary example. I'm not sure how many of you know him. This is a beautiful real-time example. Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, Hafidhullah. He's based in Chicago area. He's a white American scholar. He's been around for quite a while. He's in his 70s. He had a sheikh before, a guide who actually was African, and his sheikh passed away. And then when his sheikh passed away, he went and got another spiritual mentor, a spiritual guide who's in the Gambia, Sheikh Muhammad Haydar al-Jilani, who's black. Now, why is it significant? For 2 reasons. This is relating to humbling oneself, of us keeping ourselves humble. Dr. Umar is old enough to be Sheikh al-Jilani's father. Dr. Umar is in his early 70s. Sheikh al-Jilani is in his late 40s. So number one, he took on a guide, even though he's a scholar, that's young enough to be his son. Number two, he's black. And for a white man, he did it specifically, for a white man to have grown up in America in the time that he grew up in America, right? To take on an African sheikh, there's something very self-conscious to work on him, because he grew up in a framework of suburban white privilege, right? So even great scholars such as this continue to do work on themselves to keep themselves humble, because tawadu, or humility, is the opposite of al-kibr, arrogance, and that means humbling oneself. Now, addressing ignorance, al-jahl, and as I mentioned last week, there are 2 types of jahl. There is jahl basit, where this is just ignorance of not knowing better because one hasn't been exposed. This is easier to treat. Jahl murakab is compounded arrogance that is deep-seated and deeply rooted. Such as Abu Jahl, the father of ignorance, had this jahl murakab, and he kept his tribalistic and ignorant views into the very day that he died. He never relinquished them. So firstly, Sayyiduna Ali ibn Abi Talib, may Allah ennoble his countenance and be well pleased with him, said, At nas a'da'u ma jahilu. People are adversaries of what they are ignorant of. Right? So this is Jahl Basit. So people are enemies of what they are ignorant of. People are prone to be scared of the unknown. Right? And if people have been given false information and haven't been exposed to something different, then it's easy for that person to be inclined to hold some ignorant views about other people. And someone can hold ignorant views and still not have malicious intent. This is very important to say, because normally when we have these discussions about racism and someone's response will be, well, I'm not a bad person. Well, it's not about you or me being bad people, right? As my sheikh, my former sheikh said, who passed away, rahmatullahi alayh, he said, Dawood, he said, remember, you can be sincere and be sincerely wrong. You can be sincere and be sincerely wrong, right? So it's not about simply having malicious intent. It's not simply about intent, it's about impact, right? So one of the ways that we deal with this is a ta'aruf, that we seek out others to socialize with regularly, even in what appears to be the mundane, or we help to organize things where people can socialize with other people not like themselves, especially if they hold certain biases or certain racist views towards other people. It is to organize such events or oneself to seek out to socialize with other people, even if it appears to be mundane. You know, many things can be solved just by eating a meal with people. And as the Prophet says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, feed the people food and give them salam, right? I mean, it's something very simple. You spread peace. You give people salam, greet them, break some bread, and have conversations, and that breaks down a lot of barriers in and of itself, really. That's why many times when people are in the business world, or even I've done this, even in sectors that I deal with, when you have a one-on-one with someone to discuss something, you invite them to talk over lunch. Let's talk over lunch. A lot of business meetings take place over lunch. Help soften people up, right? So this is one thing. This is what is called experiential knowledge. You get to know people not by a book, but by a living experience that's tasted. Now, the other is in this, listening to other personal stories. It's important. And asking people to talk about their stories. You'll learn a lot. And what you'll learn is that there'll be some unique, or you'll hear some things that are unique to their personal experience, yet you will hear things that are very human that will relate to your human experience. Because at the end of the day, people are concerned about having safety, living in security, to be able to put some food on the table and eat, to have shelter, they have family life, if they have children, to make sure their children have a good education. You know, you'll see some commonalities within the human experience, and also to learn the history of their people. But this is the caveat that I put on there. Learn the history of their people from the resources which they recommend, right? Because we know there's a lot of racist material and colonialist inspired type of material, colonized frame material, even with Muslims or Arabs. We know Edward Said wrote that phenomenal book about Orientalism, right? So we should be reading resources that are recommended by the people that help tell their history accurately, right? So We have a brother here from Nigeria. So if you want to learn about Nigerian history and the Sokoto Empire and Osman Dan Fodio and Kano and that glorious history, you wouldn't go to, your first resource wouldn't be a British author who was the child of the colonists who colonized Nigeria. Like, I don't think that would be your first choice, right? Let me wrap up because we're running out of time. Steps taken by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that address racism in his society. I'll be quick. First, al-Mukha'at. He established a brotherhood and sisterhood compact in Medina. When the Muhajirin, the immigrants, came to al-Medina, and immigrants were paired off with the Ansar, or we could say the indigenous people of Medina. One was paired off with another, where they were made best friends or confidants, and they broke bread together. They looked after each other's needs, right? They checked in with each other regularly. This is one step, prophetic step, and I'll elaborate on this a little more in the next slide about examples of what we can do here in the States. He publicly addressed racism in strong and overt terms when it popped up. Like, he wasn't quiet about it. We know, I mean, one of the examples I give, people normally reference Bilal, but I'm going to reference another one. And this relates to point number 4 about encourage intertribal and interracial marriages. What gets lost on us is that one of the Prophet's wives was not an Arab. That kind of loses our consciousness sometimes. Mu'mineen Sophia radiallahu anha came from a Jewish tribe. She did not come from one of the Arab tribes. She came from Jewish tribe. She became Muslim, but she came from Jewish tribe. She wasn't Arabiya. She came from, so there was an issue in which one of the Prophet's wives got jealous at Mu'mineen Sophia, and she would ridicule her along with another wife, and they would call her Yahudiya bint Yahudiyin. They would call her Jew girl, O daughter of Jews. But she was a Muslim. She wasn't Jewish, but they were mocking her and making fun of her. This relates to the ayah of the Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat, when Allah says, let not women make fun of other women, perhaps they are better than you. This is what this relates to. The Prophet ﷺ found out about this, and he said, say, proclaim, my father is Harun, my uncle is Musa, and my husband is Muhammad ﷺ. And then he addressed it with the people. And this is what's called, in the science of Quran, Asbab al-Nuzul, the occasions of the revelations, when Allah revealed the verse in the Quran, let not women make fun of other women because perhaps they are better than you. This related to racist speech that was done when one of the Prophet's wives was saying racial remarks against another wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I say this again, if the companions themselves had some racist attitudes and said racist things, then we're definitely not better than them. But the Prophet addressed it, and he addressed these things. And he addressed these things publicly too, by the way. And this was part of his last sermon. The Arab is not better than the non-Arab, nor is the non-Arab better than the Arab. And the black is not better than the white, nor is the white better than the black. Illa bit taqwa, except in taqwa. He also did, some might say this was a type of medieval affirmative action that he did. And this should have been, excuse me, in this slide, it said appointed Qurayshis. It should be non-Qurayshis. This was a mistake that I made in the slide, if you're taking a picture. But he appointed non-Qurayshis and non-Arabs to positions, which was a confirmation of their merits. Because in the olden times, people didn't get positions because of merit. They got positions because of their tribal connection. So one thing, when people talk about Bilal calling the adhan, it wasn't simply because he had a good voice, and that wasn't his only position. Bilal was also Khazin Bayt al-Mal. He was the first treasurer of the Ummah. He was the money man. He was the man that the Prophet ﷺ would have collect sadaqah and collect the charity. And then when poor people came, he was the one that would dispense the charity to people. That's a very high position. Same thing with Usama ibn Zayd. Usama ibn Zayd was the last companion of the Prophet ﷺ that was appointed by him to be the commander of the army. Who was Usama ibn Zayd? Usama ibn Zayd was black, and both of his parents had been formerly enslaved. His father, Zayd ibn Haritha, and his mother, Baraka Ayman. She was Ethiopian. So the Prophet ﷺ could have easily picked Omar to be the commander, or Abu Bakr to be the commander, or one of these people from Quraysh, or Khalid ibn al-Walid. No, he picked Usama ibn Zayd to be the field commander. And Usama also was a teenager, by the way. He was a teenager and he was black. Now, in conclusion, application to address anti-blackness today. I have 4 points. Firstly, start in the Muslim community with being intentional about setting up brotherhood, sisterhood compacts among Muslim youth. Commit to at least monthly meetings and interactions. So we did this here. We got together with youth groups from different masajid, and we actually had people, we assigned different people, one sister to one sister, one brother to one brother. They exchanged email addresses. They exchanged phone numbers. They made a pledge to call each other at least once a week. And then once a month, one parent would drive their child to one's house, and then another month to the other's house, or go to the masjid that one person would normally go to for a program, and then the other month, the other one would go to the other one and drive around, right? This is very intentional. Specifically of different ethnic groups. And this thing that we started, about 12 years ago, a number of these people are still friends to this day. We started 12 years ago. Number 2, diversify speakers and programming. The black sheikh and the black sheikha who is qualified can come to the community and teach on issues such as tazkiyah, tafsir, and sirah, not just on racism or the ceremonial invitation to the Black History Month program. It's actually kind of patronizing when you have someone who's a big scholar or a sister who is like very well accomplished and she's an academic, but the only time she's invited to speak is during Black History Month. If you know about American history, there's no such thing as American history without Black history. Every month in America is Black History Month. There is no America without Black folks, as we know it today. So when you invite the university professor, or you invite the sheikh or the female scholar or whoever it is, then make sure you diversify your program and be intentional about doing this. And I'm not saying that Medina Institute is guilty of this, because I know that you're not. Actually, I was invited to speak at the program in Ramadan that had nothing to do with Black people. It was about Sayyidina Ali and that program. But nonetheless, this is just some tawqeed, this affirmation, right? This is general advice. The next thing is create a culture that does not frown upon interracial marriages. This is a big one, especially when it comes to South Asian Arab women being able to marry Black men. Now, why do I say this? Why do I specify these genders? Well, let's first back up. One of my teachers, he's actually Iraqi, he said, you know what, Dawood? He says, you know, when the rubber meets the road, someone can say they're not racist all they want, but when someone comes to ask to marry their daughter and there's nothing wrong with them, but the only reason they say no is because they're Black, then that's when the racism comes out. That's the only issue. Quietly, actually, my wife was Pakistani. She's from, she grew up in Canada. When we got married, there was some aunties that were calling my mother-in-law, trying to dissuade her to not, to try to break up us getting married. But alhamdulillah, Amma told them off. Alhamdulillah, right? She told them off. I mean, in a halal way, right? But why I say women and men is because it's this issue of controlling women, right? So sometimes people view an interracial marriage like, oh, like these black guys trying to conquer our women, right? It's not as big as a deal if Brother Usama or Brother Abu Bakr goes out and marries a white American sister or another sister like that. It's not as much in my anecdotal observation over like the last 2-3 decades. I've seen less opposition to that, right, than the other way around. So it has to be a culture created where it's talked about and it's not frowned upon, and we can teach directly from the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and from the second and third generations of Muslims, we can see where these marriages actually were not uncommon. And in fact, the Prophet ﷺ actually encouraged a number of these marriages, such as Fatima bint Qais, who was from Quraysh. Her marriage was arranged by the Prophet to Usama ibn Zayd, the black guy I just was talking about earlier, right? And Bilal's wife was black. But even Ayman Baraka, she was Ethiopian, but her husband, Zayd ibn Haritha, was Arab. So it went both ways. The black woman who was a companion was married to the Arab man. Ali ibn Abi Talib was Arab, and who he married after Fatima died, that he had his son Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya. She was a South Asian with dark skin, darker than mine, right? She's described as Kanat Sindiya Sauda. She was described as a black skin woman, a woman with black skin from Sindh, which is modern day Pakistan. That was Ali ibn Abi Talib's wife, right? So colorism is an issue in this too. It's not just racism, because I have a friend who's Hyderabadi, and he went to marry a sister who was Bangladeshi, and she was darker, and the mother refused to go to the wedding because she wanted so-called fair and beautiful grandchildren. So we have to be honest about that. There's no place in that in Islam for this colorism and turning somebody away because you think the young lady is too dark and all these sorts of things. Even in the same group of Desis, of South Asians, right? That's totally unacceptable. And we should start a community campaign against Fair and Lovely skin bleach cream. I'm serious. In Ghana, they made skin bleach cream illegal. First country in Africa, they made it illegal. Alhamdulillah, they made it illegal. It's banned to be sold publicly. You can't buy Fair and Lovely and skin bleach cream in Ghana, right? Maybe we need to start a campaign to have Muslim stores stop selling Fair and Lovely, because our Muslim-owned stores here, they sell Fair and Lovely. It's right behind the cash register or next to the cash register. You got the skin bleaching soap, and then you got the cream and all of those types of things. Astaghfirullah. The last point is learn about Black history beginning in West Africa, not simply the enslavement of Africans in America. Our history of African Americans doesn't start with us being enslaved. We're not a people of slaves. We have a people who have a dignified, noble history prior to coming here. And also, there is historical evidence that points to Black people came to the Americas before Columbus got lost coming over here. He didn't discover anything. He even trying to come here, he got lost. So there's books written about this, Tariq as-Sudan. And we're talking about Abu Bakr II, who was related to Mansa Musa, the great Malian king who sailed here. There's been artifacts that have been shown in certain places in Mexico and in New Mexico and in Arizona of things carved in Arabic, in rocks. There's a book written by a non-Muslim scholar, the late Dr. Ivan Van Sertima wrote a book called They Came Before Columbus, where he gathered the archaeological and anthropological evidence that shows that African people came here about a century before Columbus got lost coming over here, right? You need to learn Black history beyond Black people being enslaved. And this includes the history of the great Muslim civilizations of West Africa, like the Malian Empire and the Sokoto Empire and the Ghanaian Empire, and these great people like Mansa Musa and Askia Torre Muhammad and Uthman Den Fodio, Abdullahi Den Fodio, and all Sheikh Mohammed Bello, Nana Ismail, one of the great female Islamic scholars, right? So these are people that we should know about and get familiar with. This will help us out tremendously, I believe, if we start to implement some of these things, all four of these things in our community. I think this will help us out tremendously. With that, I will stop my portion of the presentation. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khairan, Imam Dawood. This was very enriching, eye-opening, and how beautifully you laid out some of our history from Quran and Sunnah, but also the stories and examples from prophetic life. So before we go to Sarah, let me just say thank you to you one more time. And it's going to take me time to absorb all of that and beautiful, beautiful knowledge. So thank you so much for sharing that. We'll come back to you with question and answers after Sarah speaks. So Sarah, would you take the virtual mic?
Sure. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Jazakallah again to Sheikh Dawood for setting that stage so beautifully and for again proving that our beloved Prophet ﷺ was the anti-racist role model for all of us, right? He was truly the role model in so many ways, but also the anti-racist role model. Let me go ahead and share my screen as well. Hold on one second, I apologize. 1 second. Ready? Can y'all see that yet? No. There you go. Are y'all able to see that? Okay. Great. So you're gonna hear echoes of what Sheikh Saab also said in some of the points that I make. So inshallah, let's go ahead and get started. And so I think the goals of my talk, and I'm hopefully not going to spend too much time because I want to hear from you all as well. So I'm going to be asking the audience some questions that you can answer via the chat, or I encourage you to speak up and use your, unmute yourself for a second and then share some of your thoughts as well. So we're going to focus on some solutions, right? And I think 3 solutions that I want us to focus on. There's many solutions. This could cover hours and hours, right? So focusing on a couple of things. And the first thing that Sheikh Dawood also pointed out was spending some time and energy recognizing our own biases and privilege. I'm going to talk a little bit about taking specifically an anti-racist perspective, because the first point and the second point are not mutually inclusive there. You can recognize when you are biased, yet still not take a fully anti-racist perspective. And then spend a little bit of time on potential community and policy-based solutions, okay? Again, I'm gonna just briefly summarize what we talked about in the last week, which was we talked about racism being a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on a personal social interpretation of how somebody looks, right? And that interpretation results in unfair disadvantage to certain people. Race is a social construct, not a genetic basis, right? There's not a genetic basis. I will keep showing this very painful picture because you know what else bugs me about this picture? The man has The policeman has hands in his pocket. When do you know, what do you associate with people putting hands in their pocket? What does that remind you of? When do you put your hands in your pocket? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Anyone like to share?
When you want to distance yourself from others, it's a sign of arrogance, maybe.
Yeah, it's sort of a sign of arrogance. Sign of an arrogance. It's like, I got this. I own this street. I'm casual. I'm relaxed. I got my hands in my pocket. I'm getting ready to murder a black man, but my hands are in my pocket, right? And that's what's been bugging me as well about this picture. It's this laissez-faire, blasé attitude, right? And so I want to show you this picture again to remind you. Oh, there's something in the chat as well. Sorry if I missed it. Sophia, if you could just keep your eye on the chat and keep me up to date on that, on the discussion, because I do want this discussion to continue. So it's not just one racist man, right? Or one cruel man or one arrogant man. It is a man who is part of a system, right? A system of racism and a system of culture, a system that has promoted a culture of explicit and implicit bias. And it's a lack of accountability against a certain group of people, right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because we've covered it already, right? Last time we talked.
The comment is that it's like you don't want to touch something because you don't find it appealing.
Ah, yes. Good point. You keep your hands in your pocket to keep it protected, right? Protected from what you think might be a little dirty, right? Absolutely. Not going to spend a lot on time on this, but remember, I want the audience to make a very clear, I want all y'all to have a clear connection here between the policies that helped bring America into the greatest economy of the world, one of the greatest, strongest economies of the world, policies that were set forth by great presidents like FDR, right? But that had very far-reaching racist consequences that we see up until today in 2020, right? The inability, the institutionalized blockade of Black people's ability to own homes and accumulate wealth was purposeful and planned. And we see those consequences, including redlining today. Last time we also talked about the different kinds of racism, right? We talked about explicit bias being a form of prejudice. We talked about colorism that Sheikh Dawood also mentioned today, that is very much in our South Asian and Middle Eastern communities that we have to own up to, right? And we have to call out. We talked about implicit biases and microaggressions as well. So now let's go into solutions. So that was just a summary of some of the things we talked about last time. So the first thing we've got to do, remember, is recognizing our own biases, right? So I'm going to share, and Sheikh Dawood also encourages us to share each other's stories, because stories have an impact that in some ways a graph or data just doesn't, right? So let me share the story that I'm ashamed about. I'm ashamed to admit. So I was leaving the grocery store 2 weeks ago. So I'm driving out and I'm at the red light, and I look to the right and there's a car, and I see a very dapper, handsome Black gentleman, young, probably in his 20s, in a Mercedes, parked next to my car, right outside of Kroger on Chenal. And if I'm honest with myself and you all, I did a double take. Why did I do a double take? I think I did a double take because that was my bias manifesting on my own in my car. I was by myself. That was my bias manifesting because I don't associate young Black men with wealth and education, right? That's my unconscious or conscious, partially conscious bias coming out because I know I did a double take, right? And I was immediately ashamed. And I have been processing and digesting and thinking about my racist response for the past 2 weeks. And I'm trying to get past it. And it keeps coming up in my mind, right? So catch yourself when you see yourself doing that. Because I caught myself, right? And so it is about creating a culture And it's important, the first step in creating a culture is talking about it, right? And I will echo with what Sheikh Dawood also said about our frowning on interracial marriages. I will tell you that my youngest sister, Shireen, married a gentleman from Sudan. And as we were talking, my parents were saying, oh, he's getting married. She's getting married to Bahi Malik. Several of my family members said, oh, well, at least he's a doctor, right? Where did that at least come from? What is that at least about? The at least is a condolence, right? A tasalli, a comfort. Let me provide you comfort. Your daughter is marrying a black man, but at least he's a doctor, right? So let's not forget those little slight, you see those, pay attention to those little phrases and words that come into the conversations that we have every single day. And call yourself out, right? As you say those phrases. Or if you take that double take, call yourself out. It's painful. My heart rate's going up as I'm talking about it because it's painful for me to admit that I did this 2 weeks ago, that this happened. But I think it's important to talk about. Let's also recognize, let's recognize as Muslims, for the Muslims in this conversation today, we are at a disadvantage, right? Our names might influence if we get a job or not, right? My sister who lives in Washington, D.C., we're not talking about Alabama or Arkansas. Washington, D.C. went to buy a cat from somebody. And when that person saw that her last name was Ahmed, that person did not respond back to her. And when my sister confronted her and said, hey, you didn't respond back to me. We were done with this deal. I'm getting ready to pay you and I'm coming to your house. And she said, well, you know, I was just worried to make sure you weren't Arab. And my sister said, I'm actually American. And the woman said, well, I'm glad you're not Arab. And my sister was quiet at the moment, right? And had to take time to process that. So our names do influence how people interact with us. People, and I give special props to our hijabi sisters, right? Because people do discriminate and do have stereotypes of Muslims. And our hijabi sisters put themselves out there every single day to face that discrimination and stereotype head on. And we know those stereotypes are not positive ones, right? We also know that we're disadvantaged because brown is less than white, right? Brown is less than white. But hey, at least we're not black, right? That's our tasalli, the comfort that we give ourselves subconsciously, right? So we do have disadvantage being non-black, as if we are non-black. For those of you who are non-black, pay attention. We are at a disadvantage, right? As Muslims, we are the least liked religious minority in this country. This is Pew Research data from 17. And it shows that all groups, America is warming up to all religious groups, minorities here. But who's at the bottom? Right? It's us, right? So we Muslims do suffer from negative stereotypes in some ways. But let's all recognize our privilege. Let's take a moment to recognize our privilege, right? We don't have white people privilege, but we have privilege. Do we fear for our lives when we encounter the police? For those of you who are non-black in this conversation, do we fear for our lives when we encounter the police? I'll wait for an answer.
We have a no in the chat box.
Okay. That's my answer. My answer is no. When I see the police, I'm like, oh, phew. Okay, we're gonna be okay, right? What is the stereotype of South Asians? Let me speak specifically to our South Asians. What is our stereotype? When people see us on the street or when people see us, what is the stereotype of South Asians? Are you a doctor? That's the stereotype. Are you a doctor? Are you a scientist? No one is surprised when they look at me and I say that I'm a doctor. No one, right? Because there are so many of us. 10% of Muslims in this country, 10% of all the physicians in this country, 10% are Muslim, right? So we benefit, for those of us non-black Muslims, we benefit from our stereotypes, right? So, and that's excluding hijab. Our hijabi sisters do face stereotypes, and I'm not going to minimize that by any chance. So let's just, I'm sharing my stories with you for all of you to trigger your stories and think about where we have to recognize our privilege and what our stereotypes and biases are. So that's step one. Step one solution to moving towards anti-racism, to helping this process, is to recognize it in ourselves. As Sheikh Dawood talked about, purifying our hearts, right? Fixing our own hearts. So that's number one. Number two, let's take an anti-racist perspective. And that takes work, right? So just because I recognize for a second that I was unfair to a Black person in a Mercedes, that does not make me an anti-racist. That just makes me realize that, okay, maybe I made a little bit of a mistake, right? A little bit of a mistake. So an anti-racist perspective is, it's not enough to be not racist. Our next step as we evolve as humans in this country, as Americans in this country, is to take an anti-racist perspective. Ibram Kendi is a PhD and professor at Boston University. And he's a best-selling writer. And he basically gives us a playbook, a handbook, step by step, about how we should approach racism and how we can be anti-racist. And in it, he gives us 3 lessons. 1, to see all forms of racism clearly. See them clearly as they are. And I can tell you we don't. We're not all there. We're not there yet. Number 2, understand the poisonous consequences of racism. And we spent a good deal of time last time talking about some of those poisonous consequences of racism. And number 3, work to oppose them in our systems and in ourselves, right? So I've spent some time talking about racism in ourselves. I'm going to spend 5 minutes reviewing very quickly, because I think it's important for us to understand the consequences of racism if I didn't make myself clear in the last talk, right? Racism has resulted in all of these things: in the dehumanization of the Black person, in the criminalization of the Black community, poverty, poor health consequences. There are mental health consequences. And also these negative stereotypes that are in the air, right, get internalized by Black people themselves. Just like so many of us have internalized the negative stereotypes about Muslims, a lot of Black people have internalized those negative stereotypes. And we talked about internalized racism last time. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. And then disparities in educational access. And as an educator, I will tell you that it's the disparities in educational access that are going to keep us in the same position 20 years from now if we don't do something big, if we don't do something significant in our educational system, right? So again, you've seen this picture before. And as I've also said, we think up to 20% of slaves who were brought to this country were Muslims, right? So Islam was in the heart of Black slaves, right? So this gentleman could have been a Muslim. And even if he wasn't a Muslim, right, as a human being, we have that. I hope that this picture brings pain to your heart. I hope you look at this picture and that it's ingrained in your mind, right? Remember, for slavery to work, for the system to work, white people had to propagate an agenda of the Black savage, right? A savage who wasn't a person who wasn't civilized, who didn't have God, who was godless, even if 20% of them were Muslim too, right? Who was godless. And that agenda was quite successful, because that agenda is still alive. It's weakened, it's decreased, it's evolved, but it is still in our system and in our air today. If I tell you that I would, if someone says, where did you go? Where are you from? I would go all the way to Timbuktu. What do you think about Timbuktu? What's your thought about Timbuktu? What are the first things that you think of if someone says Timbuktu?
Gold.
Gold. How do you know that?
Because it was like a center of gold, and like it was like one of the richest places in the world back then.
It was one of the richest places in the world. You made me proud today, Dima. Good job. What else?
Thank you.
What do other people think about when they think of Timbuktu? I'll tell you what, some people say, where the hell is Timbuktu? I don't know where it is. Is it in the middle of nowhere? It must be uncivilized, uneducated, random. And as Dima appropriately said, Timbuktu was none of those things. Timbuktu was the center of Islamic and intellectual excellence, right? In Africa, right? It was an area rich in wealth, lots of trade, lots of educational, right? Value came from Timbuktu. Yet, what is the narrative in America of Timbuktu? In the middle of nowhere. Nobody knows that. that is also a form of racism, right? That is a form of minimizing Black people and minimizing African people, right? So important point. So dehumanization, number one. Criminalization, right? We talked a little bit about this last time as well. This, I want you to remember this kid's face. I did not elect to show you the other picture of him that haunts me to this day when I see it, that gives me, that constricts my chest when I see it. This is George Stinney Jr. He was an African-American child who was convicted of first-degree murder in 1944, in 1941 or 1944, where he was convicted of murdering 2 girls. He went to jail. His trial lasted all of 2 hours, and the jury made a decision, the all-white jury made a decision in less than 10 minutes that he was guilty. He was murdered and sentenced to death by the electric chair, and he was killed at the age of 14 in America, right? The criminalization of the Black man, and in this case, even more egregiously, the child. That conviction was actually overturned in 2014, but it was a little bit late. I put Nixon, our President Nixon's image here because, and I did not go into this in our last talk, but we can give credit to President Nixon for the official systematized modern criminalization of Black people. His war on drugs was really a war on Black people, and his chief of staff admitted that in an interview. The plan of war on drugs was really to keep Black people at an economic disadvantage, and America bought it, and we still talk about it today. America bought it, Reagan perpetuated it, and so did our President Bill Clinton, right? So I'm not trying to make an enemy out of everybody, but I do feel that it is very important that we know our history, because when we know our history, then we can only change it, right? Poverty. Racism has resulted in poverty. This is downtown Baltimore, one of the 25 most dangerous neighborhoods in America. So what do you think when you see this? If you were driving by this street, what words come to your mind? What comes to your mind? What might be, if you were uneducated about the system, what would come to your mind? What might come to your parents' minds? I'll take a minute to let y'all share. Thoughts?
Poor, crime, drugs.
Yeah, right?
Not safe.
Right. Poor, crime-ridden, all these Black people. If they could only just get rid of those drugs, if they could only just work harder, right? They need to prevent from taking money from our government, these welfare queens, these ghettos. These are the words that come to our minds sometimes. But because we now study, and because we know what comes to my mind now, which is a change from previous, right? What comes to my mind is redlining. That's the first word that comes to my mind now. The loan officers denying a Black person. I think of a man sitting in a bank, a man or a woman sitting in the bank asking for a loan, and the loan officers denying them that loan because they're Black. That's what I see, right? But the country doesn't see that. And it's not because the country is all racist. It's just lack of knowledge, right? Let me make this a little bit more real to you. For every $1 the white man a white person earns, an Asian earns $1.23. And for every dollar a white person makes in this country, a Black person makes 59 cents. There's your disparity right there, right? There's your economics. And this is the direct result of racist policies, right? We know that there are higher rates and worse outcomes with Black people with diabetes, right? With hypertension, with heart disease, with cancer. Remember the picture of that grocery store that I shared last time? The picture of the grocery store close to my house and the one on Broadway? If you go inside the Broadway, how many of you have gone inside that Broadway grocery store? I bet none of you have. Oh, you have, all right, Sophia. I did too, but not out of nothing heroic. I went there because I was getting a headache and I was going towards Harmony Clinic, and that Broadway grocery store is right there. There is no fresh produce in that grocery store. There are no apples, nothing. No fresh fruits, no fresh vegetables. Also a consequence of racist policies that have been brought down, right? We know that, I've said that. And it's the small indignities, right? This is a study by Tara Goddard, and it's been famous and it has been cited a lot. So she did a study, this was only in 2014. She did this study where she had 6 trained male participants, 3 white and 3 black, all dressed in the same snazzy suits, very well dressed. And they simulated someone trying to cross the crosswalk, a pedestrian. And there were trained observers at the corner of the street who were cataloging the number of cars that passed, right? And the time until a driver stopped to let these people, let these individuals cross. And what the study revealed was that black pedestrians were passed by twice as many cars and experienced wait times that are 32% longer than white pedestrians, right? So this is data that shows that black people deal with small indignities and that people may not even be conscious about, that result in accumulated toxic stress that also results in higher outcomes of diabetes and heart disease and high blood pressure, right? We talk about educational access, right? There's a movie called The Best of Enemies. It's got Taraji P. Henson in it. I don't know if any one of y'all saw it, but since you're home quarantined, take a look at that movie, Best of Enemies. It came out maybe a year or two ago. And it was set in North Carolina in 1971, the year I was born. And schools in North Carolina at that point, even though, right, there was civil rights had occurred, schools were still segregated. And the story is different. And I want you to focus, I focused on one thing in that movie that really struck me. That in the black schools, all the books, and this is verified, this is not just North Carolina, this was all across the South and the North as well. So the 12th grade books, the textbooks that the 12th graders at the black school learned were actually 11th grade books, the old 11th grade books from the white schools. So what does that tell you? That tells me that the smartest senior at that black school in North Carolina would still, no matter what, be behind the least smartest white kid who graduated from the white school, right? Because the black kid from the 12th grade got the 11th grade book, right? Always behind, right? So when someone says, why can't they just study harder? Why, everything is fine now. Everything's equal now. Well, 1971, that was the year I was on the earth at this time. And that has continued. It didn't stop in 71, right? So this disparity, and that was purposeful. That was a purposeful disadvantage and disparity that was brought upon black schools, right? The mental trauma, I referred to this as well. So when I was a kid, I loved going to the hotel swimming pools because we don't have a swimming pool in my house. So going to the hotel swimming pools when I was a kid was like a thing of excitement, right? So do y'all know this gentleman? Anyone know him? His name is Brian Stevenson. He is now 60 years old, and he is the executive director and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. Have y'all heard of the movie Just Mercy? He wrote the book. This is about him. And he shares a story. I had the opportunity to meet him in November in Phoenix. And he shared a story with us at this conference. And he said, I think he was about 12 years old. And he goes on vacation with his mother and his sister. And he's all excited about the pool at the hotel. And so they park the car, he goes into his room, he quickly changes into his swimming trunks. He's super excited with his sister. And he goes out in the pool and he jumps into the cold water. And he is just in heaven, right? He comes out and he surfaces. And he looks around and he sees that all the white people are scrambling to get out of the pool. And all the white people are staring at him. And he remembers the shame that he feels. And his eyes start to burn with tears. And he's trying really hard to hold back those tears, right? And he starts moving to come out of the pool. And his mom said, oh no, don't you get out of that pool. You deserve to be in that pool. And so a bunch of white people are staring at him. He's scared to death, and his mother is saying, don't you get out of that pool. You deserve to be in that pool. So if you were that kid, how would you feel? What word comes to your mind if you're that kid? I'll wait for an answer.
So Amina said nightmare.
Yeah.
Heartbroken. Cynthia said heartbroken.
Yeah. Absolutely. Heartbroken, nightmare. That's a traumatic instance. That's one of those things that people in that pool didn't think twice about doing to a young Black kid. That's traumatizing. That's the kind of a story that changes someone's life, right? Right? And I will tell you, you think it's like ancient history because he's 60 years old. For those of you in Arkansas who are listening in, up until 1989, when I graduated from high school, the Cabot, Arkansas community pool did not allow Black people. 1989, Black people were not allowed in the Cabot, Arkansas community pool, which is 25 miles away from here, 30 miles away from here, right? So this is not ancient history. So that is what I mean about, so I share these stories because I want you to internalize these stories and remember these stories so that when you hear somebody say, this is you taking an anti-racist stance. When someone says something even slight about Black people, subtle, right? This is when you, right? Allah says that if you see something bad, what are you supposed to do, right? You either try to change it with your, just physically with your hand, right? You try to remove that evil with your hand. You work to address that evil with your tongue, or at the least bit in your heart, right? And what I'm saying is, I feel like we've always said, well, I've condemned it in my heart. That's not enough, folks. We're in 2020, and we're in the middle of the largest civil rights movement of the world that the world has ever seen. Let's strengthen our faith, and let's not just keep it in our heart. You're gonna have to speak out, and I know that's not easy. I know that a lot of you on this in this conversation are young people, and I know that is not easy. But I want you to start working on it today, so that by the time you're my age, or even before that, you will inshallah feel better speaking out in kind ways, right? I don't like this call out culture. I don't want to call out culture. I'm not promoting that, but speak out in kind ways, right? Remember, one of my favorite hadiths is when the Prophet ﷺ, when he saw, they were in a mosque and they saw a man. Remember this hadith, when they saw a man doing wudu incorrectly, right? What was the lesson from that hadith? What was the lesson that we've talked about before? You go up to that person and you say, oh, you got that wrong, dude. You just messed up, brother. No. What do you do? What happened in that story, right? We teach indirectly. We make ourselves vulnerable a little bit so that the person who doesn't know something sees us and learns from us, right? So that man who didn't know how to do wudu correctly saw another person teaching somebody how to do wudu. So remember that as a lesson. Let's not call out, but do it with kindness, right? And then the final thing that Dr. Ibram Kendi tells us is to work to oppose racist policies. So speak out when you hear it. We talked about that. And then talking about education and policy. Let's talk about education and policy for just a little bit, for 2 minutes. So how do you speak out? This is a very subtle way of speaking out. All of us have social media. I know that we're on Instagram and we're on Facebook and what's the other one that the younger people do? I forgot. It'll come to me in a minute. Part of the reason that good people are biased is because we see so many negative images of Black people in the media, right? And so for years we said, oh, it's the media's fault. It's CNN's fault. It's NBC. They're the ones who are doing the bad stuff. They're showing the images of Black people that make us internalize those negative images. So now the world has changed, folks. We now have the power to counter the media with our own social media, right? So the question is, are we doing that? So I'm going to ask you, one day a week, If you're posting, if you like posting pictures of your friends and your selfies and all the outfit and the cool things that you're doing, take a day out of the week and post a positive image of someone of color whom you admire, like Dr. Kendi. It takes intellectual capital to be an anti-racist. It takes us being smarter to be an anti-racist, right? And to do that, you've got to educate yourself. You got to read, and you got to put these images out there, because I can guarantee you that there are 8 out of 10 people will look at this man and not assume that he's a PhD. Isn't that right? That's our bias coming out. So I want everybody to know what Ibram Kendi looks like. He's a professor at BU and he's a PhD. He's an expert in his field, and that's important. So speak out on social media if you feel safe and if you can do that, but do it in subtle ways so that the people who are seeing your post don't even realize what you're doing. You're doing it so subtly, right? But speaking out, right? It's important to speak out. I think, and this is where I'm focusing on, we've got to correct our history books, right? So the picture on the upper right, as traumatizing as that picture is important to see for those of us who live in Arkansas especially, because this happened in our state, guys. 237 sharecroppers were shot and or hanged for trying to organize for their rights. This is called the Elaine Massacre. Of those of you who live in Arkansas, did anyone know about the Elaine Massacre? Did y'all learn about it in high school? I'm curious to know, because I went to high school a little bit earlier than y'all did. Anyone learn about the Elaine Massacre?
So, no.
No. So I know Dima's still at Central High. Dima's still in high school. Dima, you haven't learned about it yet, right? So
No.
why didn't I, go ahead. Nose, more nose. So folks, why didn't why didn't we learn about the Elaine Massacre? It happened an hour and a half from Little Rock. When I look it up, when you Google Elaine Massacre, why does Wikipedia call it the Elaine race riots? Why don't they call it a massacre? Some people call it a massacre. Some people call it a race riot. Why didn't I learn that Harriet Tubman, once she freed slaves, she kept freeing slaves? And why didn't I learn that she became a leader for the Union Army? Did y'all learn that? Dima, did you learn that?
Nope.
Okay. Why didn't I learn that FDR's social programs left out Black people? That only 2% of Black people benefited from the federal housing loans, thus never accumulating wealth? Dima, did you learn that yet? Did they talk about that?
Nope.
So why haven't we learned this? It's an essential part of our history. It is because that it doesn't fit the white supremacist agenda, right? When I say white supremacists, please don't just think of KKK. They're not the only white supremacists, right? Take the word literally. It does not fit an agenda. There are very few history books that are sold to schools that include this. And it's part of what we call the whitewashing of our history, right? We don't want to show the history that doesn't really suit the majority. And this is not an attack on white people necessarily. It's an attack on all majorities. If you look in India, the Hindu, in many states, they have gotten rid of the Muslim history in the textbooks, right? In Pakistan, a lot of my Pakistani friends say that their history books, and they were taught in school that Gandhi was a bad man, right? So every state, every majority has its agenda that they're trying to propagate. So now that we know true history, our job is to reach out to the principals. Write a letter to your principal. Ask your principal, why isn't this taught in the schools, in your classes? It is the job of us adults to organize and write letters to school districts, to our Department of Education, right? To serve on our library committees, to serve on our city committees and our councils, to get involved with social justice organizations like Just Communities in Arkansas here, right? Medina Institute partners with JCA on so many levels. Our JCA meetings are held in Medina. There's a reason for that, right? We are showing that we are housing. We are not just agreeing with social justice. We are housing it. We are giving people the space to propagate that and to learn and to implement those social justice practices in the country, in our state, in our city. These are very important, small and large gestures. Arkansas is one of the few states that doesn't have a hate crime law. We have been working for the past 2 years to help get that passed, and it's failed, right? It's failed. So all of us are empowered to even write one letter per week to our Department of Education, to our principals, to our superintendents, right? I'm not saying that we all have to go out and protest and show up, right? We don't have to do that, although there's value to that, right? Protest, not everybody has to do that. A lot of people say, oh, that's just a show, that's just showing off. Well, let me tell you, in the last 2 weeks of protests, we have achieved so much in this state. It's like we fast forwarded, right? Multiple states in the country have made commitments to reform their police departments, right? Confederate statues that have got to be so painful to see have come down. The co-founders of large organizations like Reddit have resigned to make space for people of color to come into their boards, right? A database has been set up in the last 2 weeks to set up a system across the country to record police brutality. Protests and coming together have done this. But I think that whenever we say do something, work on policy, we think protests. Protests are just the start, right? Protests are kind of the easier part in some ways. The hard part is sitting down, opening up your laptop and writing a letter to your superintendent or principal or your school district. That's the hard work. And so we see Medina Institute continues to be engaged in that kind of work, and we want to see you guys continue to do that. And the cool thing is Medina Institute you've got a place where you can start to do that work. I will end on that note. I seek forgiveness for any mistakes that I may have made, and I definitely seek your input and feedback, inshallah. And I think we have a few minutes for discussion and questions. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, Sarah, and Jazakumullah khairan to you as well. This has been such an enlightening discussion by both of you. If we have just 4 minutes left, and I was wondering, Imam Daud, if you're still with us, would you take just a minute to tell us about the books that you have written, their names, and what is the best way to get them? So it's recorded here, and our students can benefit from them.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So firstly, and I have something that is, inshallah, will hopefully be out by September, another work, but I co-authored 2 books, and I also wrote one solo. So the first book is called Centering Black Narrative, Black Muslim Nobles Among the Early Pious Muslims. And that book can be gotten on Amazon.com. So that book is about firstly defining what Blackness meant in Arabian society 1400 years ago, which includes Black Arabs, and that's a major misconception that Blackness and Arabness are somehow mutually exclusive. They never have been, and even more so back 1400 years ago. So it talks about that issue and a number of the people who were Black from the Sahaba in the 2nd generation. And Bilal was not mentioned in the book specifically because Bilal has been tokenized. So we did not mention Bilal, though that was no disrespect to Bilal, but we know about that. The second book is volume 2 of that. It's called Centering Black Narrative, Ahlul Bayt, Blackness in Africa. So it's an extension that talks about the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ, who were considered phenotypically Black, and a number of them had African mothers. So we talk about these imams, and as well as some women that have connection back to the Prophet in the time, starting with the Umayyad Caliphate or the Khulafa, Bani Umayyah, into Bani Abbas. Then the third book that I wrote is called Towards Sacred Activism. Towards Sacred Activism is a book about giving, it's a guidebook that provides some sacred parameters or social justice activism, right? So there's a specific language that draws upon our scholarly tradition from our faith, as well as from the teachings of Tasawwuf. So that is towards sacred activism. So that book can be purchased at meccabooks.com or at amazon.com.
Thank you so much, Imam Dawood, for sharing that. We have recorded the video, as you know, and we'll be sharing it with our students. And I want to thank both of you, Dr. Sarah Tariq and Imam Dawood Walid, one more time for your generosity in time, for your wisdom, for your guidance, for your knowledge. And I want to thank all of you who joined us today, and those of you who will be watching this video in a few days, for taking this step to start learning about this problem. And before we close, I just want to share with you that for the last few days and weeks, I have been thinking and pondering and reflecting that what is my role in all of this? What can I do? And I made a few notes to myself, things that I'm going to do, and there are three. I'm going to learn, listen, and let them lead. These are the three key things I'm going to do: learn, listen, and let them lead. And I was so pleased today because when I was listening to the presentations, both of our speakers, you both confirmed and affirmed what I was going to do, what I'm going to do. So I want to tell all our students that please take every opportunity to learn about the spiritual malady of kibr and jahal and the biases and prejudice and implicit and explicit biases that reside within us, because somehow we Muslims, although we belong to this beautiful deen of Islam, which indeed is founded on this universal human equality, principle of universal human equality. And our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the first one who spoke against racism 1400 years ago and led Medinan state and erased racism from it. But we still are we still have racism in our hearts, and we debate about it. And I've seen it on Facebook in the last few days. We're always debating about it, that we Muslims cannot be racist. But today we learned from our Imam that even Sahaba were careful about it. They were checking themselves all the time. Then who are we in front of all those Sahaba? So I think it's really, really important that we keep on learning about ourselves. Last time I said, Man arafa nafsuhu faqad arafa rabbuhu. It's very important to know yourself in order to know God. And the process of tazkiyatun nafs should be a daily process, not once a year or once in a lifetime process. We should be doing our tazkiyah on a daily level. So please remember to learn about this melody at an individual level, from books, from videos, from taking a teacher, a spiritual teacher who can guide you through the process. That's my first step that I'm doing, learning. And secondly, that I'm doing for myself is listening. And I'm so glad that you both talked about it. Listen to the stories of African Americans, by them, through them. One of my spiritual teachers and scholar that I follow is Imam Ghazali, but today I learned about another one, Imam Ahmadu Bamba, who wrote Masalik al-Jinan. I didn't know that, so I'm going to get that book, and I'll be reading about Imam Ahmadu Bamba, and we learned a lot of other beautiful information from Imam Dawood about who were some of our great African scholars. So let's listen to the glorious Islamic history and also glorious Black history by Black scholars. So that's the number two thing that I'll be doing, and I hope you all do too, all of our students. And the third thing which I'm going to do is, of course we are leading, but at this front, let them lead. This is the time when our African American brothers and sisters should be leading, and we should be helping them and supporting them because it's their experience. So listen to their stories and help them lead this movement. So again, before we go, remember, as we look towards the community problems and policy issues that we are going to help with, we are going to speak up, we are going to go to the protests, we are going to write letters and do everything that our teachers told us today. But it always starts from the smallest unit of the society, and the smallest unit of the society is ourselves. And change begins from within. So let's change ourselves, and that hopefully will change our households. It will lead to changing the culture within our organizations. It will lead to change the culture in our communities and eventually to the whole country. Having that said, thank you so much for joining. Imam Daud, would you please close us with a dua? And I hope to see you all in our next session, and we'll be announcing that very soon.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر آمين. السلام عليكم.
Wa alaikum assalam.